the global cosmetics regulatory landscape. And this will be presented by one of our team authors, Jay Ingram from Delphic HSE. Jay is Director of Europe, the Middle East, and Africa at Delphic, where he's been for 3 years. He's a toxicologist by training and has spent nearly 15 years in the regulatory toxicology area, primarily focusing on the safety assessment of personal care and cosmetic products. So Jay, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to speak about the global cosmetics regulatory landscape. We've got a lot to cover because this is an area where a lot is happening. Yeah, we'll try and get through as much as we can, as quickly as we can. Just to give you an overview of what we'll be talking about today, I'll be giving you a bit of a historical context behind animal test ban legislation. We'll talk about the current regulatory landscape. Then we'll dive in and do a bit of a spotlight on some key regulatory regions and how they have approached animal testing as it pertains to cosmetics. We'll spend a little bit of time as well looking at the similarities and differences between these various regulatory frameworks. And then we'll go on to talk about some of the complications in implementing effective cosmetic and chemicals management regulation as they relate to animal testing. And we'll finish off by talking about how we can actually provide some solutions and some of the opportunities that are available to overcome some of these complications that we've seen in the past. Kate mentioned it before. I'll be pausing at various points for us to answer some questions that you might have. So please do pop them in the question box, and we will we'll get to them as soon as we can. So without further ado, let's crack on. First, let's look at some learning objectives. Kate mentioned there is going to be the Slido quiz at the end, so please do pay attention, and hopefully by the end of this webinar, you should be able to outline the historical context of the regulatory landscape, identify which countries and regions have cosmetic testing and sales bans, compare and contrast some differing styles and pieces of legislation, explain some complications that can arise in the development and implementation of legislation, and finally describe opportunities and solutions made possible through the use of the AFSA principles. So keep your eyes peeled. Now, to give a little bit of a historical context, really the history of animal test ban regulation globally goes back really almost 30 years. In 1993, there was the first proposal for a marketing ban on cosmetics tested on animals that was proposed in the EU. However, this was debated for a number of years, and it was felt ultimately in 1997 that we hadn't really made enough technological advancements to be able to have confidence in non-animal approaches, and so this ban was postponed in 1997 due to a lack of alternatives. However, 1 year after that, the UK became the first country to ban animal testing, and this was really on cosmetic products. And they did also ban animal testing on ingredients intended primarily for vanity products or sort of cosmetic products. Then we kind of flash forward just over a decade when the EU has implemented its first marketing ban. There were 2 marketing bans in the EU, and this first one was really about the kind of simple endpoints where there were in vitro alternatives already available. And this was followed up in 2013 by the second animal testing marketing ban in the EU, which covered all endpoints and effectively made animal testing on cosmetic products and ingredients prohibited after this point. In 2014, India became the first Asian country to ban animal testing on cosmetic products and ingredients. And recently in 2021, China has finally allowed the marketing of general cosmetics without the use of animal testing. So this is really a very small snapshot, and we'll dive into a few of these and a few other regions when we look at our regulatory spotlight. But there has been a long history of animal test bans, and this is still going, as we'll see going along. So to give you an overview of the current regulatory landscape, this is how the world looks in relation to animal test ban regulations. You can see we have 4 distinct colors here. In this dark purple, we have these regions where legislation has been passed to prohibit animal testing on cosmetic products and their ingredients. We have this light purple color here where we have no federally mandated animal test ban. However, individual states have implemented legislation to prohibit animal testing on cosmetics. We have this dark gray box, which really only pertains to China. And we'll speak a little bit more in our spotlight on why this is such a special case and why it doesn't really fit into a proper animal test ban type regulation. Then we also have some lighter gray regions such as ASEAN, South Africa, Chile, and Canada, where there is legislation that's in development and it just has not been passed yet. So this is what the world looks like as it pertains to animal test ban regulation. And now we're going to dive in and just have a look at some individual regions. We won't be able to have time to cover every region in this webinar. This is a lot to talk about, but we will be discussing these in a little bit more detail in the module. So please kind of stay tuned for that. And we'll be able to go into a lot more depth on what the animal test regulations are in all of these regions where they've been passed or are in progress. So we'll start with the European Union. As we mentioned in the timeline, there was 2 kind of fundamental milestones within this piece of regulation. This regulation is often called the EU Cosmetics Regulation, but to give its official title, it is EC 1223/2009. It focuses on finished products and ingredients, not just finished products. And it's important to note that it prohibits animal testing in order to meet the requirements of this regulation. Now, what this means is that in order to assess the safety of a cosmetic product, it's not allowed to use animal test data after these 2 milestone dates here. However, you are permitted to conduct animal testing if it's for the purposes of another regulatory framework. We'll speak a little bit more later about why this exemption and caveat is really important and really noteworthy. But it's important to note that this is a key aspect of the European cosmetics regulation. So we spoke earlier that there was 2 key milestones in the European Union cosmetic regulation implementation. The first one was in 2009, and it focused on the endpoints of acute toxicity, skin and eye irritation, skin sensitization, and genetic toxicity. These were seen as sort of simpler endpoints that could be risk assessed using more in vitro methods. And then in 2013, there was a ban on repeated dose toxicity, developmental and reproductive tox, and carcinogenicity studies using animals. And this is interesting as in 2009, it was felt that science was at a significant or sufficiently advanced stage that we could cover the risk of these particular endpoints using alternative methods. However, when 2013 came around, the methods weren't really available at that time, and yet the ban was still put in place. And this is another important note that we'll touch on later on when we talk about some of our complications. So that's really the EU. We'll move now to China, who implemented the Cosmetics Supervision and Administration Regulation, and this really went live in 2021. It's important to note that this is not an animal testing ban. However, in China, it was historically required to test all cosmetic products on animals prior to their placing on the market. What the CSAR regulation allows for is the avoidance of animal testing, but only for general cosmetic products. The special cosmetic products that you can see here are things like hair dyes or hair perming, spot treatments or sunscreens, any of these kind of more active cosmetic products. For these, you still do require animal testing prior to marketing. There are some caveats when it comes to avoiding animal testing, and one of which is to have sufficient proof of good manufacturing practice of the cosmetics. Now, this proof will only really be accepted if it's accredited by a national body, which would be fine. However, there are some countries in the world that don't have a sort of national accreditation when it comes to GMP. So this is a bit of an issue that we've found when trying to take advantage of the avoidance of animal testing in China. In addition to special cosmetics, animal testing is also needed for any product that is specifically intended to be used on or by children or infants, as well as brand new cosmetic products. So we're moving in the right direction in China, but there is still a long way to go. And this is particularly the case when it comes to the acceptance of alternative methods. In China, at the minute, they are very much focused on a one-to-one replacement, replacing one animal test with a specific in vitro test. But as we'll discuss, new approach methodologies are a lot more multifaceted than just a typical one-to-one replacement. And we really need to think a little bit more broader and laterally to be able to make use of them to make good risk assessment-based decisions. So really, we need to incorporate more IATA type approaches when it comes to risk assessment, specifically in China. Hopefully, with the new defined approach for skin sensitization, this will provide an opportunity where we can, prove to regulators that, we can utilize NAMs in a way that is different to a one-to-one replacement, but is still effective at proving safety for consumers. Moving to India, as I mentioned in 2014, India became the first Asian country to ban the animal testing of cosmetics. And in India, the regulation of cosmetics is controlled by the cosmetics rules. And they have passed two specific rules relating to animal testing. The first being Rule 135B, which states that no cosmetic that has been tested on animals shall be imported into the country. And this was really the first step in India addressing animal testing as it pertains to cosmetics. They then followed this up with Rule 148C, which states that no person shall use any animal testing for cosmetics, and this incorporates both products and ingredients. In Korea, they passed the Cosmetics Act in 2015, and this came into force in 2018. And this relates to also both products and ingredients, and it bans the animal testing on products and ingredients. However, this does exclude specifically preservatives, UV filters, and pigments. Another key exemption when it comes to the Korean Cosmetics Act is that this really only applies where alternative methods are available and have been approved by the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety. Now, these alternatives really, again, focus more on a one-to-one replacement. So they really talk about the non-complex endpoints and skin sensitization as well, where we have validated in vitro test assays that we can use. So although, they're moving in the right direction, again, there is still more work that can be done in Korea. Now, Australia have their Industrial Chemicals Act of 2019, and this will be in place in July of 2022. and it states that new ingredients that are used exclusively in cosmetics cannot use animal testing to prove safety. Um, However, this is not applicable for ingredients that may have an industrial use. And this is similar to what we saw in the EU, which had that caveat of animal testing, which can be done for other regulatory frameworks. And the Australian Industrial Chemicals Act very much aligns with the EU approach and the exemptions. If there is to be animal testing that is required, it first must be approved by the executive director. So there is, some form of check and balance when it comes to actually conducting animal testing in Australia. But it's important to note those key exemptions. Now, Mexico was very recently joined the animal test ban train. They passed a regulation in September of 2021, which prohibits the manufacture, import, and marketing of cosmetics containing ingredients that have been tested on animals. They have allowed for a 2-year transition period to replace animal testing with alternative methods to assess safety and efficacy of cosmetic products. And it's also important to know that a product must be labeled to indicate that no animal testing has taken place. But really important, that this is evidenced and able to be proven, so that people can make this claim and that consumers can make really the best choices when they're buying products on the market. Turkey also has passed some regulation prohibiting the testing on both products and ingredients. In July 2015, they first restricted the animal testing on cosmetics, but they went the full way and prohibited animal testing in January of 2016. Like a lot of these regulations, there are some exemptions. We have the exemptions that are the same as kind of the European Union, such as the specific human health concern. If there is a very considerable human health concern, and the view is that it cannot be really addressed without the use of animal testing, then animal testing is permitted, as well as the fulfilling of regulations of other countries or other purposes. However, Turkey does have this unique one, which is where an ingredient is in widespread use and cannot be replaced, but still requires some animal testing, then this can be carried out. The Turkish Competent Authority has published guidelines on alternative test methods, but again, these don't really go the full way of fully accepting new approach methodologies. Yeah, it is also focused more on a kind of one-to-one replacement and in vitro type of test methods. So that's it for kind of federal, countrywide or region-wide regulation. Like I said, we haven't been able to talk about all of the different regions because we'd be here all day, but do stay tuned for the module when we publish that. But we should mention the USA and Brazil. There is no overarching federal piece of legislation that pertains to the banning of animal testing in cosmetics. However, there are some states that have taken it upon themselves to implement regulations. California was the first state to do this, and they implemented a ban in 2019. Nevada followed suit very shortly in June, and Illinois in September. And Virginia and Maryland have passed some regulation, and this will be effective as of July of this year. So this is very exciting news in the US. And there is some exciting activity happening in the US from a regulatory perspective that we'll speak about a little bit later on. Brazil is another country where there is no federally mandated animal test ban. There have been some animal tests that have been abolished by the regulatory authority, but 10 states in particular have prohibited animal testing. And these states represent over 70% of Brazil's national cosmetic industry, which is a significant amount, obviously. There was an attempt by Rio de Janeiro to prohibit the sale of cosmetics that were tested on animals in other Brazilian states, but sadly this was not passed. And so they still kind of do allow animals to be tested on in other states that don't have a ban, and then sort of, for want of a better term, imported to other states. So this is really the way that the world sits in terms of animal test ban regulation. But as we've seen, there are some kind of key differences in some of these regulations, and we wanted to compare and highlight just a few of these pieces of regulation. So what we saw with the European Union, this relates to all cosmetic products. It covers both finished products and ingredients. However, we do have this exemption that prohibits animal testing in order to meet the requirements of this regulation, but allowing animal testing for other regulatory purposes. The CSAR is not a ban, as we saw, but it only relates to general cosmetics. It excludes these special cosmetics. Still requires animal tests for key cosmetic products, and requires this proof of GMP for it all to be considered okay to avoid animal testing. In Korea, this also covers all cosmetics, and like the European Union, covers both finished product and ingredients. However, it has these exclusions of preservatives, UV filters, and pigments, and it's really only allowed where alternative methods have been approved by the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety. So whilst these kind of all seem like animal test ban regulations, they all have aspects where there is still loopholes that allow for animal testing to be conducted on cosmetic products. And this is really why we need to start looking at holistic legislative frameworks to be able to close these loopholes and not allow animal testing when it's really unnecessary, as we have technology that can address these issues. If we're to look a little bit more broadly, we can see the similarities and differences between these pieces of regulation. For the most part, all of these pieces of regulation consider finished products and ingredients. They all have some kind of exemptions, whether this is testing required under other regulatory frameworks or to address specific human safety concern. There are key and important exemptions to these bans. When it comes to the differences, one of the key differences is the actual definition of a cosmetic product. And this is really important, actually, when we're talking about animal testing bans, because if there are differences in what a cosmetic actually is, it means that you may have a product that animal testing is prohibited on in one region. However, it is required for another region. So it's really important to note that actually defining the classification of your product can have a significant influence on whether there will need to be animal testing done on that product or not. Another key difference that we saw is this presence of special cosmetics in China. And again, in South Korea, they only allow animal testing bans where validated alternatives are available. There are some countries which haven't passed federal law, although there are state level legislations. And although we didn't get a chance to cover it, some countries really have a difference between locally produced cosmetic products and imported cosmetic products. And this is the case in New Zealand. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of all of the different regions, or most of the regions. Going to take a little minute to see if there's any Q&As that we can answer. I don't see any in the chat box at the minute. So I propose that we will continue. Let's talk about the complications that we've seen in implementing good quality animal testing ban regulation. And then we'll have another stop before our next section if there are any questions you might have. Oh, and just as I say that, one comes up. I would like to clarify regarding the EU animal testing ban. When performing an exposure assessment for a cosmetic ingredient that is not exclusively used in cosmetics, can the data generated from animal studies, including a skin irritation study after July 2013, be used for safety substantiation of such ingredients? I would say no. I'm assuming you mean a risk assessment instead of just exposure assessment. But no, if animal testing data has been generated after the animal testing ban, it should not be used for the safety substantiation in your cosmetic safety assessment for the EU. Okay. So when it comes to implementing cosmetics regulations, we need to really appreciate that cosmetics don't exist in a bubble. You know, it's not just that cosmetics are governed by the cosmetic regulation in their particular region of sale. We need to accept and appreciate that cosmetics are made up of chemicals. And as a result, they are impacted, whether directly or indirectly, by other pieces of legislation. And the chief of these is really chemicals management regulation. Things like REACH or Korea REACH or what is happening in the UK with UK REACH now. We also need to accept that cosmetics will be impacted by GHS and CLP, although cosmetics are typically exempt from these pieces of legislation. The fact that their ingredients are governed by these regulations is really important to note. And again, coming back to our definition of a cosmetic, when we have these borderline products that may be considered a cosmetic in one region, or a medical device, or biocide, or an OTC drug in another region, this really impacts the actual implementation of cosmetic regulation and animal test ban regulation globally. Again, also what we've seen is that many animal test bans exempt animal testing for other regulatory purposes. So, you know, this banning of animal testing is really only going part of the way if all of these other regulatory frameworks that impact cosmetic products are still allowing and really even requiring and driving the use of animals in safety assessment. We're going to look at one in particular, one region in particular, which is the EU, as it is a really good case study for how these various different regulations impact and affect cosmetic products when it comes to animal testing. So first we'll talk about REACH. And if you're not familiar with REACH, it is a chemicals management regulation. It focuses on individual substances. And it requires specific pieces of information that are based on the tonnage of a material that is made or imported into the EU. And these information requirements relate to specific single endpoint animal tests. It does allow for the use of read across and in silico predictions, but this is really only applicable within the bounds of answering this one single endpoint question and ticking that box for the information requirements. The information requirements are a collection of hazard data, and they don't really allow for exposure to enter the equation. There are some substances where exposure and risk is assessed. This happens within a chemical safety assessment. However, this isn't for every single substance. Only certain substances will be subject to a CSA. And one of the main triggers for a CSA is the hazard classification of an ingredient, which we'll talk about in the CLP section in a few slides. So every cosmetic product will be made of chemicals that will be subject to this REACH regulation. And as you can see here, this is the list of information requirements that that REACH demands at all of these different tonnage levels. And really what you can see is that there's a significant amount of animal usage that will be required for substances, especially over 10 tons per year, but even substances in quantities of as low as 1 ton per year. And it's important to note this is a very inflexible tick box list of test requirements. It doesn't really allow for a holistic type of assessment of the actual risk to humans or the environment. And that's important to note because the aim of REACH, as it states in the regulation, is to improve the protection of human health and the environment through the better and earlier identification of the intrinsic properties of chemical substances. However, when we think about actual risk and the actual impact to humans and the environment, it's really more appropriate to discuss understanding the risk to human health and the environment posed by chemical substances, rather than just looking at the potential hazard of substances. So when it comes to REACH and the information requirements, when we look at the future and if we look to incorporate new approach methodologies, we can reframe the information requirements to actually address actual risk rather than just hazard. And any of these data gaps can be filled using new approach methodologies rather than relying on animal tests to satisfy a tick box approach. And in many ways, the appropriate use of NAMs could cover a range of different endpoints with one sort of battery of tests, rather than having to go and conduct a whole number of potentially inappropriate animal tests just to be able to tick a regulatory box. It's important to note new approach methodologies really use a multifaceted and interdependent model, which doesn't really fit neatly into this tick box approach. There's a lot more than just in traditional risk assessment that we need to look at. And this is why regulatory frameworks really kind of need to be expanded and to be made more flexible to incorporate these. Now, REACH and the GHS or CLP regulation really go hand in hand. And CLP, like REACH, is based on single endpoint animal tests that are used to determine hazard classifications. Now, again, this is really hazard based and it doesn't consider exposure. However, we really need to look at the actual purpose of the CLP regulation, which is the communication of hazards throughout the supply chain. And this focuses on occupational exposure, accidental release, transport, consumer exposure, and environmental exposure. They do allow for the use of in vitro methods, but this is really only for non-complex endpoints. And it doesn't really allow for the actual application of new approach methodologies. It's interesting, that this is all about the communication of hazards. However, the number of times I said exposure when I was reading this list means we should really be thinking about exposure and having exposure-led risk drive what needs to be communicated throughout the supply chain. And new approach methodologies really offer a much smarter way of being able to do this than just focusing on the intrinsic hazard without any consideration for the context in which that is going to be applied or used. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but it's just important to note the European Chemicals Agency has been engaging in sort of non-animal discussions. However, they do still have a lot of skepticism. This is lifted from their non-animal approach report in 2017, where they felt that new approach methodologies may not provide the same level of information as the current animal studies. And also, they stated that it needs to be clarified how to make use of the evidence from non-animal approaches that do not directly inform on adversity or specific toxicities for classification under the CLP regulation. And this is a really important point, that we need to be able to be flexible in our minds in order to create policy that reflects the best science, rather than trying to fit the best science into inflexible frameworks that don't really allow for it. And this is really, really fundamental when we talk about new approach methodologies. The last kind of complication that we've really seen in implementing animal test ban regulation is this concept that the banning of animal testing is not the same as acceptance of non-animal methods. So we've seen a lot of animal test bans that have been implemented without really the appreciation for how we can then go forward and conduct risk assessments in a sensible way without the use of animals. And a lot of this sort of lack of acceptance of new approach methodologies has come from a lack of familiarity with the new approach methodologies. People just don't really know what they're all about, and they don't understand them, which leads them to believe there's a huge amount of uncertainty and leads to a low degree of confidence in their application. Also, the multifaceted nature of NAMs really extends beyond traditional toxicology. So as a toxicologist, you need to be able to sort of expand your mind beyond what we've done previously, and be able to accept the integration of, in vitro, in chemico, even mathematical modeling and big data modeling into our risk assessments, and figure out how that can be done and be a bit more specific to a human health question. And lastly, there is, validation requirements. If we are going to use non-animal methods, a lot of people will feel a lot more comfortable if these are validated. So those are the kind of the complications. We are going to now talk a little bit about some of the future opportunities and solutions we have, but we've got a couple of questions that I just will want to address. Does this mean that animal tested cosmetic products from Turkey and China are not allowed to be sold in the EU? Well, I mean, this is a very kind of complex question, and really, again, why we need to make sure there's holistic legislative frameworks. If you are using the animal test data to support the safety of your product in the EU, then you cannot use that data and the product shouldn't be sold. If the animal testing has been required by regulatory frameworks in those regions, then you can still sell the product as long as you don't rely on that information for your safety assessment. I would say, though, you should declare that those animal tests have been done as part of your product information file, and it would still be, a little bit risky, but not impossible. What happens if animal test data is generated for REACH, then impacts on the safety assessment for cosmetics? If a null from a 90-day is lower than a previously historical null, is there flexibility for the companies responsible for the cosmetic product safety assessment to ignore the new animal data and focus on NAMs, NGRA approaches instead? This is an excellent question, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give you a binary answer. This is still quite a gray area. Obviously, we need to be making sure that we are being protective of human health. So, as scientists, we would say, well, it's important that we take account of all available scientific data to be able to address these questions. What I would say is the European cosmetic regulation does allow for animal test data for specific human health concerns. So the SCCS, the scientific committee within the EU that governs cosmetics, may be petitioned to be able to sort of look at this new data, and they can make the decision over whether or not it is appropriate to use this newer data that has been generated after the ban. And in that forum, we may also be able to discuss the use of NAMs and NGRA approaches as well. Right, the next question is, how does the EU deal with endpoints for which there are no alternative methods to replace in vivo tests then, i.e. DART and carcinogenicity? Well, this is a great question. And the answer really at the minute is it doesn't really. You know, at the minute, the legislation says you cannot use data on these endpoints generated after the ban, but then there isn't really anything on the other side to say, well, this is what you do. And this is the reason why, you know, we really need to engage with regulatory bodies. We need to be able to have a good and open dialogue with them and propose our future solutions and opportunities here to be able to answer these questions using really the best science available for addressing these risk areas. So that was a really great segue into our future opportunities and solutions. Now, when it comes to actually implementing NAMs on a large scale, there's three key areas that we need to focus on. And the first is really getting this understanding of uncertainty correct in our minds, and how this relates to both traditional approaches and modern approaches. We can then also talk about building confidence through engagement and education, which is one thing that the AFSA education training program is keen to do. And once we've built this confidence, we can then begin to implement holistic legislative frameworks that are both science-based and exposure-led. So if we tackle this understanding of uncertainty, we accept that there is uncertainty when it comes to new approach methodologies. However, it shouldn't be lost on people that there is a huge amount of uncertainty that arises from the use of animal models. Animals are not the same as people, and there is a high amount of uncertainty that comes with using animals to make predictions on human toxicity. But we've used these models for a long time, so we've become more comfortable in this uncertainty. We've been more comfortable by the use of mitigating safety factors and things. And we've become confident in this uncertainty. And what we need to do is just really become confident in the uncertainty around new approach methodologies. And confidence comes really from a combination of familiarity with methods, good regulatory guidance and precedent, as well as standardized protocols. Now, you know that validation isn't a contributing factor here to this confidence, because we don't really need to validate methods using the current validation framework to be confident that they work. You know, a lot of people who have been engaging with the new approach methodologies have built a tremendous amount of confidence without the need for validation. And one thing that I think is encouraging to me, definitely, when we talk about uncertainty and confidence, is that what we're finding is new approach methodologies really frequently provide more conservative points of departure than traditional methods, which was certainly found in the case of Friedman and colleagues, where they conducted a study of 448 substances, used exposure predictions, in vitro assay data, high throughput toxicokinetic information, and used these to derive points of departure, and compared these points of departure to traditional animal-based toxicological methods. And what they found really was that of all of these substances, 90% of them had a point of departure using NAMs approaches that was less than the point of departure from traditional in vivo methods, with a ratio of 100-fold. So what we're finding here is really these NAMs are a lot more conservative in a lot of ways than the traditional animal-based models of toxicological assessment or toxicological assays. So really, we can begin to understand these new approach methodologies and how they actually fit into the risk assessment framework, and begin to be a lot more confident in their uses by looking at studies like this, by saying, actually, we're not doing things that are cavalier and outside the realms of possibility. We can compare them to data sets that we do know and actually feel confident that they're providing a lot more protection than maybe the previous traditional methods had given us. And once we begin to be comfortable with this uncertainty, we can start building confidence through engagement and education. And actually, we can do these at the same time. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these slides, as Kate did a really excellent job in taking us through these at the beginning. But really, this is what AFSA is all about. We want to bring everybody along on the same journey, as there's a lot of science that has been happening over the past couple of decades. And really what we need to do now is make sure that everybody is able to access this and understand it and begin to engage in the discussion. So we have the AFSA modules that we've mapped against the risk assessment process with the global regulatory environment that kind of fits across all of the pieces. And this is really important because without the engagement of regulators, without sensible policy being made, all of this is almost for nothing, because we won't be able to apply it, we won't be able to use it, and we won't be able to make better safety decisions going forward without policies that allow us to do that. So we have our risk assessment modules, and as Kate explained, we're mapping them across this risk assessment framework to really provide the confidence that we can conduct a thorough and scientifically robust safety assessment using new approach methodologies in a way that that predicts human safety outcomes in a much better way than traditional animal-based models. But it's not really just AFSA who is involved in this engagement and this education. There is an intergovernmental collaboration called Apra, which stands for the Accelerating the Pace of Chemical Risk Assessment. And this incorporates regulators from Australia, Canada, the EU, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and the US. And really the whole point of Apra is to gain common understanding of the current state of the science, applications of NAMs, which includes the regulatory context. It aims for increased understanding of realistic benchmarks for performance of new approach methodologies in a variety of regulatory contexts. It aims to determine mechanisms to enhance data sharing capabilities, which is really critical when it comes to promoting and the use of NAMs. It also aims to increase engagement and commitment to the development and sharing of case studies of mutual interest. And lastly, it aims for increased cross-agency collaboration to strategically address barriers and limitations of the use of NAMs in a regulatory context. And there's a lot of really great stuff that is coming out of Apra. A lot of great leadership coming from Health Canada, and the EPA is doing a lot of great work here as well. And I should say Australia is also pitching in and doing some really good science in how we can actually leverage the use of NAMs. And we'll go into a lot more detail on Apra when we develop the and implement the module. So like I say, please do engage with that so that we can begin to share a lot more of what's happening. But also we put a link there at the bottom if you want to have a look at some of the outputs from some of the Apra meetings and what they're doing, because it's really exciting. Also recently in the UK Trade Association for Cosmetics, the CTPA, they hosted a workshop on NAMs in March this year. And they were really keen to include industry, regulators, academics, and NGOs. And this was a really exciting meeting to be a part of, because it was really one of the first that I had seen where all of these groups were together and talking with the same aim of really understanding and promoting NAMs. There were a couple of really key outputs that I wanted to share that I think are very important for all of us when we think about NAMs and we think about the future of risk assessment, not just of cosmetics, but of chemicals and biologics and everything. And that really, there is a lot of science and capability that sits behind new approach methodologies. What we need to do is make sure that we avoid a kind of two-tier world where some people have accessibility to NAMS technology and capability and others don't. And this is why it is, again, really, really important to make sure regulators can come on board with NAMS so that government guidance can be produced that's clear and very applicable to all. So, you know, we can have SMEs be able to continue to trade and to be a part of the safety assessment activities, even if they may not have the access to the types of technology and capability as some of the larger companies who have been contributing to this science. One thing that was really encouraging for me was hearing regulators from different parts of the UK government who really agreed that there needs to be more cross-governmental awareness and acceptance. And they were very, very keen to take this away and make sure that they were collaborating as different governmental departments to be able to make sure that they're all kind of pushing towards the same goal and all sharing the same science and engagement with academia and industry. And really, lastly, we all decided that we really require constructive dialogue. When it comes to NAMs, there has been some reluctance, and a lot of this reluctance has resulted in almost a rejection of new approach methodologies. But in order to have these be available and be successful, we need to make sure that any dialogue around this is constructive and allows for almost a safe space for the experimental leveraging of the methods that we see, where we can have almost a sandbox to be playing in, and then we can develop methods to such an extent that everybody is confident and happy to use these in a real life situation. And Professor Alan Bubis, who is a very eminent toxicologist, he's an academic at Imperial College London. He had a great quote where he said that we have reached a stage where there's a real opportunity for new approach methodologies to transform chemical risk assessment, but this will only happen if all relevant parties work together on a common objective. And he is absolutely right. And so we need to make sure that everybody is in the room, everybody is benefiting from what we're doing here at AFSA, and everybody is beginning to engage and be educated. And really, the whole tagline became of this workshop that we're ready, we're there, the science is available, we just need to do it, which I thought was very inspiring. So once we've built confidence, once we've completed our engagement and education, this really needs to transform into the building of holistic legislative frameworks. And we talked about REACH, which aims to improve the protection of human health and the environment. And when it comes to new approach methodologies versus traditional methods, new approach methodologies are geared towards offering protection. Whereas previous traditional toxicology based on animal tests are really only focused on prediction. What do we predict might happen in a human based on what's happening in this rat right now? Whereas new approach methodologies are exposure-led and human-relevant and also hypothesis-driven, so that we can frame the risk assessment question a lot more towards how do we protect human health rather than how do we predict what might possibly happen. And when it comes to REACH as well, there was a framework for chemical safety assessment that was produced by Ball et al., which I've kind of used one of their figures for here on the right. And really, it aims to bring in exposure a lot more to the REACH chemical safety assessment framework and use this to drive prioritization by using a matrix of exposure over potency. And it's encouraging that this is actually also being used by Health Canada in the Apra collaboration, as we saw before. And it's a really, really great method of helping to prioritize and screen substances and products so that we can focus on those that are the most risky by incorporating exposure and hazard. I want to finish off by just talking about the US Toxic Substances Control Act update in 2016. And this is a really, I think, encouraging piece of regulation, as it is really one of the first pieces of regulation that I've seen that it not just accepts the fact that new approach methodologies are available and exist, it really aims to drive these forward. You can see that in this section 4, it states that in general, the administrator shall reduce and replace to the extent practical the use of vertebrate animals in the testing of chemical substances. It talks about, prioritizing performance assessment, validation, and translational studies to accelerate the development of scientifically valid test methods and strategies that reduce, refine, or replace the use of animals. And that any person developing information for submission shall first attempt to develop the information by means of an alternative test method or strategy. So you see, it isn't just that, you can do some read across or there are some in vitro studies available. It's really trying to look a little bit more holistically, and it is almost challenging people but driving towards accepting new approach methodologies as a whole, rather than sticking to a sort of inflexible tick box type of approach. It also incorporates some really, I think, critical parts when it comes to building holistic legislative frameworks, such as making sure that there is collaboration across different aspects of governmental and regulatory bodies. It leverages and makes the most of public and private partnerships. And it makes sure that whatever is decided and implemented and built meets the needs not just of regulators, but also end users. So really focusing on protecting human health, protecting the environment, and doing that in a risk-based and exposure-led way. So yeah, what we can see is that the TSC update allows for a much more flexible type of approach to regulation. It's allowing for decisions to be made based on the level of risk, incorporating exposure and leading with exposure, making sure that we prioritize and evaluate chemicals that are risk-based, not just hazard-based, for both new and existing chemicals. That there is screening that is happening, but this is being done in a sensible and tiered way by reasonably available existing information, looking at scientifically valid test methods and strategies that don't use animals, and also utilizing some chemical grouping so that we can begin to read across a lot of this data, not just to one chemical, but to similar chemicals as well. And I found it also interesting that the EPA has this time limit of 1 year to establish a risk-based screening process to determine whether existing chemicals are low or high priority, and we are leveraging this type of matrix that we saw in the Ball paper. Ball initially looked at developing this for REACH, but it's interesting to see how it's having applications in many different regions when it comes to chemicals management, regulation, and risk assessment. So, there are, I think, a lot of opportunities that we have available to us. There's some great work happening, here in the US, also in Canada, and we'll dive into a lot more of that when we have the module. So again, please do attend and engage with that. But we can also see through a bunch of other regulatory frameworks that we've touched on today, there is still a lot to do. There's still a lot of acceptance that needs to happen, and there is still really a lot of confidence that needs to be built. And this is why I think the AFSA collaboration is really such an exciting and strong collaboration, because it really aims to bring everybody onto the same page so that we can have sensible discussions, and everybody knows exactly what's being talked about, so that we can start actually looking to the future, making policy decisions that are based on accurate and robust science that doesn't need the use of animals. So just to wrap everything up, there has been a long history of animal testing ban legislation. We looked at a nice timeline of that. There are a whole bunch of regulations that are established but still evolving globally. A lot of these are very, very similar, but there are some regional variations, some differences in caveats and exemptions, product type exclusions, etc. We discussed some of the complications that we've seen in developing and implementing animal test ban regulation. We've looked at how banning animal testing is not the same as acceptance of new approach methodologies, and how uncertainty in NAMs kind of can fuel low confidence. But then we also looked at some opportunities and solutions, the AFSA collaboration being a huge part of building this confidence through education, and also looked at the using this confidence to construct holistic policy and accepting and promoting new approach methodologies. Because like I said, without holistic policy, this really valuable and important science won't be able to be implemented or leveraged. So it's really, really important that we start to be able to use this science and build some regulatory frameworks on that. So thank you very much for your time. There is a link to a survey. I think that will be sent out after the webinar as well. So please do provide some feedback. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I think we still have one more question to answer. The existing overconfidence in animal data is coming in the way of developing new approach methodologies, and that is caveat for regulatory authorities to continue to rely more on animal data. Yeah, there is this overconfidence in animal data, and I think that part of the issue is people don't really appreciate the huge amount of uncertainty that exists using animal data. And it's always that thing where we kind of fear what we don't understand, and we fear those things that are new. And with toxicology as well, those of us who have been fortunate enough to be involved in some of the new approach methodology discussions and approaches, we've become comfortable and confident in these approaches, but it takes time, and it takes a changing of mindset from the traditional toxicology to be able to accept not just new methods of toxicology, but also incorporation of different aspects of different sciences. So we see a huge reliance on chemistry experts when it comes to new approach methodologies. We see a greater reliance on mathematical modelers, statisticians. We see a huge requirement for big data. And being able to shift our mindsets from the traditional toxicology to incorporating these new multifaceted and multidimensional kind of approaches really is required. And I think it's that which is really making a lot of regulators lean back on the overconfidence on animal data, because they just haven't had that opportunity to engage with these new approaches.